Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallette, and thanks for being with us. We've got 2 episodes for you today. You'll hear my interviews with 2 elected officials for the very first time in the show to help us launch Ballotpedia's artificial intelligence deepfake legislation tracker. This new one-of-a-kind tracker, officially our 3rd by the way, will provide insight into the current status of legislation addressing deepfake technology in state legislatures across the country, surveying historical trends in this policy area. Both of the legislators we had on the show, one Democratic and one Republican legislator, have sponsored bills on deepfakes, and we thought inviting them on would be a great way to provide some more insight to not only what is being discussed with this legislation, but on how the different states and different parties are thinking about addressing this really new and emerging area of politics related to artificial intelligence, innovations, and challenges. Let's quickly get caught up. What are deepfakes exactly anyway, you may be wondering. So deepfakes we define as videos, images, or audio files that have been generated or manipulated by artificial intelligence in order to realistically portray something that did not actually occur. That's a pretty technical definition, but you can imagine what it really looks like then. And as this technology has emerged, public policy organizations, lawmakers, and journalists have expressed concerns related to the use of deepfake technology, whether we're talking about the proliferation of child sexual abuse material and other non-consensual sexual content, or the distribution of deceptive political communications and election disinformation or property rights infringement, harassment, fraud, and threats to national security even. The list of use cases goes on and on. This is a really emerging area. We've seen 4 times as many bills enacted this year than the prior 4 years combined. So far, 480 bills have been introduced in just the first 6.5 months of this year alone. So as the technology advances, lawmakers and advocates are having to think through, how does our government want to govern and regulate deepfakes? This is a really interesting new emerging policy area, and we're excited to delve into it. 2 legislators on this show today. And we hope listeners out there will make use of our new AI deepfake legislation tracker at ballotpedia.org. Now let's get to the show. Part 1 will be with my conversation with Nguyen, a Democratic member of the Washington State Senate representing District 34. Senator Nguyen sponsored Washington State Senate Bill 5838, which established an artificial intelligence task force that will explore different use cases, think through how to address developments like deepfakes, and set the standard for where Washington State wants to go with respect to AI regulation. If you like this episode and don't want to miss out on conversations like this one, make sure to like and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, here's my conversation with Senator Nguyen. Senator Nguyen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this really interesting and new developing legislation area around deepfakes. Can you tell me a little bit about how you and your colleagues decided to create your task force with SB 5838? Was there a tipping point that triggered you all into action? Has it been on your radar for a little bit of some time as a continuation of some prior legislation? Just kind of walk us through how we got here in Washington.
Yeah, so this topic we've been working on for quite a while, if I'm honest as well. So the AI component, candidly, is very new. Obviously, it's newsworthy now because a lot of folks are talking about AI as it relates to synthetic media or deepfakes. But there was a former Senator, David Frocht, who was also from the Seattle area, that had been concerned around manipulation of social media posts using deepfakes in general. So he had ran bills previously. He had ran a bill a few years ago around the prohibition of deepfakes. That version didn't pass, but the very next year did. It was just a short session, so more of a timing than anything. So Senator Valdez actually passed the version that David Frocht had introduced, saying that you cannot use impersonations on political ads. That's a violation, just to make a very clear line. And then we continued that actually last year, where one of the senators, Mark Mullet, his daughter, the school that she was attending after homecoming, had an incident where some folks were using deepfakes to really bully some of the students that were there. So that was part of the whole effort around just mitigating deepfakes and ensuring that the protections that we have currently in law also extended, say, for instance, to the AI space. So this has been going on for quite some time. And the concept itself isn't new. The thing that's interesting now is that with AI, obviously the manipulation becomes much easier to do and much more realistic as well.
Yeah, and I think as we found out prior to this call, with both of us being parents of young kids, it becomes particularly prescient and interesting to us as we think about that for our own personal hats and lives. Um, what was the process like for putting your bill together? Was there some broad consensus over it? Was it more complicated and nuanced there, or do you find that there's some pretty bipartisan backing to this issue?
Yeah. So what's fascinating around the deepfakes or just manipulation of media in general, because of national politics, there's certainly a tension associated with it where um, candidly, there's one party that believes that this is part of free speech, that this is necessary, that it was okay. It ended up being a fairly contentious bill, but ended up being bipartisan at the same time. In terms of the deepfakes bill, what I will note is that I've traveled around the past couple of years just as the chair of the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee, and I've had a couple of folks where completely unrelated to technology, I'll be at a conference and somebody says, "Hey, you're from Washington State. We wanted to do a deepfake bill because we feel this is a threat to our democracy." And they were actually members of the Republican Party as well. So I think this is now kind of a bipartisan viewpoint in that you shouldn't have fake media associated with our campaigns and our elections. I will say that that's more of the folks that are more pragmatic, potentially folks that kind of wanted to preserve our democracy. There's still a very vocal contingent um, that use it for the purposes that we do not intend. So I work a lot on our campaign side, and I had some staff go to a consulting conference around campaigns, and there was a panel about AI. And I will just say there was one. It was bipartisan. So there were Democrats, Republicans that were there, and I will just say that there's one group of people that wanted to use AI to do language translations, to have more robust engagement, to be more thoughtful around communications. And there was another that literally said we use it for deepfakes. Like we do use, like it wasn't like this is not oh, they're hiding, they might be doing something like this. It was we use this for deepfakes and we're going to deploy it in order to swing elections. And I'm not trying to be partisan in this conversation, but it was very interesting to me that not only was it something that was happening, it was almost encouraged, and that people felt very comfortable just saying it publicly.
And it is very interesting. And it is interesting to see, you have a blending of this issue where, when we've been going through the bills and we've seen hundreds of bills in the legislative sessions this year, which is almost 4 times as many bills as last year. And when we kind of group them into different buckets, we like to call them, there's a pretty strong pattern that comes through, which is that you have a lot of bills focused on political communications and a lot of bills focused on, sexual imagery, things like that. And sometimes those bills blur, though. And what have you seen as someone who's been active in this space? Is the issue being split, or do you find that the legislation is actually kind of blurring the two topics together, which, to your point, might introduce some more of the political elements to it, as opposed to, there are some groups who are just trying to focus on the teenage bullying and the sexual side of things. So, what have you seen on that front?
Ours, in Washington State's case, they were split. So the version around political speech and impersonations was separate from the version as it relates to the harm that could cause by sexual harassment, essentially, is what was happening. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was like a conscious decision to split them up. I think what happens is, oftentimes, as you see in the legislation, an issue arises, whether it's national or local, and somebody drafts a bill in response to that particular issue. So the first one just happened to be during, the presidential elections in 2020. We saw a lot of deepfakes happening in political spaces. We saw a lot of misinformation online. So that bill was specifically targeting those efforts. And then it wasn't until AI came out and the ability to use deepfakes in inappropriate ways, we had members who were impacted by it. Their families were impacted by it. So that bill was ran separate. So in terms of why they were separate or why they might be blended together, it probably was a timing issue. We tend to be pretty progressive on these types of policies in Washington State. So as they happened, we probably responded right away. What I will say is that, as a legislator who has a leadership role in some of these policies, I've noticed that there's probably 5 states that have governments that either are fully staffed, meet on a regular basis, have legislators who have some level of support associated with them as well. So what happens is you'll see a lot of these bills start in one of these 5 states, and then they make their way to the other states. And timing is really the key, right? So some states meet every other year. So in those states that meet every other year, you have a lot of legislators who are probably volunteer and don't have staff. And what they do is they just look at bills in that topic area and say, hey, Washington did this, California did this. Let's put them together because we only meet once every other year and we'll go do both. So I wonder if you look at the trends in terms of the bills that are broken out versus together, if that probably impacted it.
That is a really interesting point. And that's probably something that our legislation tracker will allow people to hopefully get to do on a more easily accessible basis going forward. And I guess I'm kind of wondering about the legislation and model legislation, so to speak, because in so many different policy areas, on all sides of the aisle, there are, groups that are activists that are at the forefront that develop model legislation or oppose legislation, right? Depending on the issue.
Yeah.
All sides of the political spectrum this happens. And I'm curious, what have you seen in this space? Are there advocacy groups leading the effort here? Is it sort of like a one state's kind of working on their own, trying to come up with legislation, and other states are just sort of trying to mimic that? Or is there a national effort here at all?
No, at least in the deepfake side. I know the ACLU has been heavily involved in some of these things. And I think in our case, the Secretary of State was involved. Candidly, from my perspective, the legislators who were working on this have been doing it for a long time, even before it became kind of in the forefront. Just because I know how this works, I suspect there probably was a national organization. It likely, maybe it was ACLU or somebody like that, because they do a good job in terms of ensuring that we have our rights protected. But I don't know of a particular effort behind it. What I will say is that the coalescing of some of the Republican folks, I'm not trying to pick on them by any means, but some of the talking points that we heard seemed very similar to things that are being said at the national level. So I don't know if that was a concerted effort or if that was just a, general ethos that kind of pervaded itself in the legislature as well. But to be clear, lots of bills happen because of national efforts or local efforts that are pushed by a particular special interest group. This one seemed to me to be organic just because the member who was doing it had been doing it for a while.
What does history tell us about this kind of thing? Like when the internet first came out and you were first starting to regulate the internet, there were probably similar conversations like, well, you can't even teach a certain generation what the internet is. How are we going to regulate it? And maybe there were similar conversations about cell phones when they first came out and things like that.
Well, that's why 230, I think, comes into play here, because then the enforcement component is actually the key. So do you say, hey, app company that lets you make these new deepfakes, are you liable for this? Because there are people who use that for their own personal reasons, legitimately. Or the deepfakes aren't meant to be nudes. It was supposed to be like you put your face on whatever, Hulk Hogan's body. You know what I mean? Like whatever it happened to be. But somebody decided to do it inappropriately. I think that's going to be the frontier in which we're going to battle. It's the liability. Is the platform liable? And then what type of enforcement is going to be? The technology component is usually moot. That's not really an issue in terms of, you have to delete it, you have to do all those different things. It's what happens when they don't comply. So I think the fight's going to be who is liable. And then after you define who is liable, you're going to define, is it a private right of action or Attorney General enforcement? I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. And we've seen some bills around around enforcement as well. Because speaking directly to that point.
Yeah.
So
it's always the enforcement component. I wrote the data privacy bill that's been passed into law in like 18 other states. We couldn't pass it in Washington State. And the funny part was I was so naive. I just wrote a bill saying this is what data privacy should probably look like. And I ignored the enforcement component because I was like, I'm not a lawyer. I don't really care. That ended up being what tanked the bill. And then other states have passed almost verbatim that bill, just tweaking the enforcement component.
Enforcement is almost everything, right?
It's everything.
Well, on a large and small scale, we have like two funny endorsement stories that I was thinking about. In California, they have a really hard time getting local counties to report election results up to the state. And the Secretary of State's always told us they don't have any enforcement mechanisms. So they can ask counties, can you please tell us your local election results, which you are supposed to statutorily do. But they can't meet them, really. They don't have any enforcement mechanisms there. So When we go to the Secretary of State, we look for results from them. They say, well, we don't always have them. We can't make them give us the. And it's like if your parents are watching your kids and they want to give the kid a cookie,
they're gonna give them a cookie.
They're gonna give them a cookie. You might tell them not to, but when you're not there, it's not gonna happen. So
so like that's actually the key. I don't think you're gonna find too many people who say, well, you may find some just because of our electoral politics happening right now, but I think most folks generally agree deepfakes are bad for politics. Deepfakes are bad for our society. There are some people who say, well, if it's there, I'm going to use it to my advantage. The key to regulating that is not so much that it's good or bad. It's, well, what happens with the enforcement component? Because you're going to find some people who also think it's bad, but don't want a preventative action. So functionally, nothing happens.
Gotcha. Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. So where do you, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a big increase this year. We're tracking about 3 times as many enacted bills this year versus last year. We tracked 12 last year and 45 so far nationally this year. And that's just, halfway through the sessions. And they're pretty split. We see these bills in Democratic trifectas, Republican trifectas, and divided governments. Where do you see this going in the future in Washington State and then nationally?
What's interesting as it relates to this topic specifically, really it's starting to move towards AI and the impacts of AI as it has on impersonation of deepfakes, because part of the concern obviously was around doing deepfakes as a whole, but now it's so easy to do that we're wanting to get ahead of some of those dynamics. And when you talk about AI, it's such a broad topic to be able to encompass that oftentimes the education, the awareness is the key. So that's why we have the AI task force. I think there's a number of topic areas as it relates to AI that needs to be addressed. And then for us, part of the timing was ChatGPT came out basically at the end of last session. You really only have a short interim in order to figure out what the policies look like, in addition to everything else that you're doing. But these are very deep and robust conversations that need to be had. So instead of trying to rush bills out to address deepfakes or AI or how it impacts labor, things like that, we really wanted to make sure that we had a focused effort to ensure that these conversations are done in a thoughtful way. So I know that Oklahoma had a AI task force. They then had their findings as well, which is interesting. And for us, I think we'll probably take a deeper dive as it relates to some of this technology and the recommendations we made before the next session. So TBD, if I'm honest, but I think the energy is definitely there.
Yeah, and do you see more activity on the political communication side of this, or on the pornographic materials non-CSAM side, or do you think it's actually going to end up being on both?
I think it's on both. I think it'll be on both because I think, come November, what I think will happen is a week before the elections, you're going to see a ton of this happening out there in very nuanced ways, and it's probably going to upset people on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
Usually when that happens, that leads to bills very, very quickly. So right now, it's kind of the wild, wild west. There's really no regulation. There's no way to identify synthetic media. I know that there are efforts around there to do it. There's companies, I've met with 3 startup companies in the past couple of weeks that are doing this. So there's one called Loti in Seattle, where if you're a celebrity or a politician or the family members of one, they will scan your face, search the internet every single day, and if they find something that is fake, which you can tell it's fake because of the algorithms, they'll pull it down. And there's another one called Truth Media, where they basically scrub the internet in a very similar way, and they will alert folks if there's something happening that seems to be related to you, but it's fake. So we're seeing a number of these. And there's another company that does it specifically for sexual assault and sexual violence situations as well. The name escapes me, but I just met their CEO the other day. She was a victim of cyberbullying and online harassment and these types of efforts. So they created a company that basically would help women mitigate this and get it pulled off the internet. So the fact that you're seeing private dollars going into this, and the fact that you're seeing kind of this ramp up that's happening, that suggests to me that there will be more policies associated with it.
Yeah. Yeah. A mixture of reactionary and proactive, it sounds like what you're saying. So, gotcha. Very, very interesting. I appreciate all of your thoughts and observations about this growing issue, and I hope that our deepfake legislation tracker will be useful as a resource to readers, activists, anyone else who's trying to learn more about this really growing policy issue in our country. So, Senator Nguyen, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to that episode with Senator Nguyen. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll discuss deepfake legislation with Representative Tony Hassenbeck from the Oklahoma House of Representatives.